All right, so we are going to finish our World War I notes today. Remove that. Here we go. Okay, so the last thing we talked about was the U.S. joining the war in 1917. Now, what did I do? Okay, so after the U.S. joined the war, President Wilson issued his 14 points. There was literally 14, it was a list of 14 points, and it outlined his vision for peace after the war. So his 14 points, this is a lot, obviously, you don't have to know all of this, but a few of the things it said, so it said no more secret agreements, no more secret alliances, free navigation of all the seas, so you can't have unrestricted submarine warfare, any ship is allowed to travel where it wants, countries to reduce weapon numbers, so countries will stop trying to increase their army and the amount of weapons that they have. It also talks about some other countries will form. So the shape of Europe, all the countries in Europe, it changes after the war because of this. It allows certain countries to form and others to break up. So like Austria-Hungary breaks up. And finally, perhaps probably the biggest thing it did is it created a League of Nations. So, well, snap. Can't say now, but the League of Nations was it was a group of representatives from all these different countries that were supposed to stop conflicts like this from happening again in the future. Now, when we joined the war, Americans started mobilizing for war. For the most part, Americans were very supportive of the war once we joined. Men signed up for the draft. So if you were between the ages of 21 and 31, you were required to sign up for the draft. Now, that does not mean you are going to have to fight. It's just you might possibly be called to fight. But a lot of people signed up to fight anyway. They didn't want to wait to be called. They thought it was their patriotic duty to go and fight for their country. Americans conserved food and contributed to bond drives. So bond drives are when you kind of like you buy a war bond, which is almost like you're donating money to the cause. And then after the war's over, you're supposed to get that money back. However, despite all this, all wartime activity remained segregated. So white soldiers and African American soldiers are still split up in the Army. They're not fighting side by side. Now, in South Carolina, we had two camps that were used to train soldiers. It was Camp Sevier in Greenville and Fort Jackson in Columbia. Now, Fort Jackson is obviously still there. So these facilities brought federal dollars into the state and stimulated the local economy because you have hundreds, if not thousands, of people coming into these camps. So the area around the camp starts to grow also. Now, these are pictures of Camp Sevier in Greenville. And this is a postcard from Camp Sevier. And one of the neat things about this postcard is it shows that they practiced digging a trench. So they could practice fighting in a trench. So you have your trench right here. So like we said, all Americans are given opportunities to show patriotism. So they started conserving resources. They would have heatless Mondays, so you don't use heat. Meatless Tuesdays, so you don't eat meat, you save the meat so it can go to the soldiers overseas. Wheatless Wednesdays, etc., etc. They had something for every day of the week. War also brought new jobs with high wages that benefited the people who didn't go to fight. So one of the things about wars is that when it's not fought over here, it usually boosts the economy because you have all these new job opportunities that are coming about because you need more weapons and you need more supplies for your soldiers and you need people to take on those jobs. So it's a lot easier to find jobs. There is also a higher demand for crops, so this is going to help the farmers in the South. Women start taking on some of the jobs that the men had to leave behind. So that's how they contribute to the war effort. They also start making supplies for the soldiers, like the picture down here. It shows a woman making gas masks. So despite all this patriotism, there was some critique of the war. And so Woodrow Wilson thought it was best to pass the Sedition Act, which outlawed criticizing the U.S. government and the war. Now, this goes directly against the First Amendment, which says you have the right to free speech. Woodrow Wilson thought it was best during wartime to stop newspapers and radio broadcasts from publishing negative articles, for publishing negative things about the war effort, because he didn't want to demoralize people. He wanted their patriotism to grow, not to decrease. So the Sedition Act was passed. You cannot criticize the government, which is not constitutional, but he did it anyway. Now, despite the good economy going on in the South, a lot of African Americans started moving up north to work in factory jobs, and this was called the Great Migration. Now, despite moving up north, you still had racial tensions in the north. You still had racism. It wasn't like they moved up north and everything was perfect. It was not. However, one of the things they were running from in the South was the KKK, which starts to come back during this time. So it had gone away under President Grant. He'd actually signed a law that we talked about, disbanding the KKK. Well, during this time, the early 1900s, the KKK starts to come back. So that is one reason why you had a lot of African Americans leaving the South and going up north. Now, despite this segregation that they still had in the military, you had lots of African American men joining the military to like prove themselves, well, we love our country too. We're just as patriotic as you are. But when they came home, they were still treated like they were second-class citizens. They still encountered racism. There were still lynchings in the South. They were not given all the credit that their white counterparts were. So even though they were just as brave and they sacrificed just as much, they were not given the same rewards that other soldiers got when they got home. Now, the war ends in November 1918, so American troops were only in Europe for a little over a year. However, over 100,000 American soldiers lost their lives in the war. The war ended when Germany surrendered. So Germany has surrendered. The World War ended at 6 a.m. And I want you to look down here. It says ex-emperor, heir, and staff all fugitives. Talking about the Russian Revolution. Now, once Germany surrendered, they were forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and it was called this because it was negotiated at the Palace of Versailles in Paris. And this treaty officially ended the war in November 1918. Now, the picture here says terms. The German people must pay for all damage to civilians on land or sea or from the air. So a lot of people said the Treaty of Versailles was very harsh because it forced Germany to basically accept all responsibility for the war. So saying that we caused this, we're the ones responsible. And because of that, we have to pay all of the damages that all these other countries had. So we have to pay you for your damaged land, and we have to pay you for the damages to your weapons. We have to fix this. And it was very tough on the German people. It took almost 100 years to pay this off. And this really turned the German people against the rest of Europe and against America. And this is one of the causes of World War II, because people are still upset over the Treaty of Versailles. All right, so we are going to stop right here. And then later this week, we will start talking about the Roaring Twenties, so the 1920s, which was like time of partying. And everyone thought that 2020 was going to be like that. And then we got the coronavirus. So we still got a few more years, so hopefully get to the Roaring Twenties. So I will see you later.